if you've been away for the last couple of episodes, what we kicked off on our Monday edition of the show is a look back at all 100 seasons of BYU football history. Now, I will add the caveat, it's actually just 99 seasons because 2024 will officially be BYU's 100th intercollegiate football season. So it's kind of been a fun project. I've been reading a lot of old articles going back to the 1920s, looking at pictures from the Harold B. Lee Library special collections of things involving BYU. But the crazy thing, let's talk about 1924. And I need to start off by saying I got confused on yesterday's show. Now, some of you may recall, and it's been put out on social media before, that the famed Knute Rockne, yes, the head coach of the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, really led Notre Dame in the early 1910s, 1920s, led Notre Dame into what they have become, synonymous with among the blue bloods or the power players in college football. Well, he's a big reason why that happened. Did you guys know that once upon a time he visited BYU? It's true. I'm going to throw this up here right now, throw this graphic up if you're watching this on YouTube. And that I was confused because I was reading an article saying that he had visited BYU in the lead up to the 1924 football season. So I was going to use it on today's show. But then when I started digging a little bit deeper, I realized I had made a mistake. He actually visited BYU in the lead up. So it'd be the summer of 1923 is when he actually officially visited BYU. Now, there's a number of people, if you're watching this on YouTube in this picture, there's probably upwards of 50. This was a coaching clinic that Knute Rockne came to BYU to be a part of. And as a result of this, Alvin Twitchell, who I'm circling right here, he was BYU football's head coach. He was obviously the first head coach in BYU's intercollegiate history. And then this gentleman right to the right, many of you who know who Knute Rockne looks like probably could put this together. That's Knute Rockne right there. Yes, the famed Notre Dame Fighting Irish coach in Provo, Utah, doing a coaching clinic. And yeah, I probably should have involved that in the 1923 season, but I apologize for the gaffe. But nonetheless, Alvin Twitchell was associated with a number of big name coaches in his day, obviously. When he went into his very first season, BYU kicked off their football history in 1922. He had spent the season or the summer prior at the University of Illinois, learning a lot of things from the Fighting Illini out there and brought those back to BYU. Associating with Knute Rockne obviously gave him that opportunity. The one thing many of us might not, and I didn't realize this until I started doing some research on this, was that Alvin Twitchell was also BYU's basketball coach during his time with the Cougars. He actually predated his time as BYU football coach, leading BYU's basketball program. Now, BYU's basketball program at this point in their history in the 1920s was well established. It was not outlawed. The sport, speaking of basketball, was not outlawed by the LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, like football was for nearly 2 decades. But Alvin Twitchell came to BYU, was a highly, highly successful basketball coach, and then helped BYU football get off to a pretty decent start. But 1924 marked the end of an era, as after the 1924 season, Alvin Twitchell moved on from Brigham Young University. He ultimately would go over to join Colorado College in Colorado Springs, Colorado. He is a native of the Centennial State out there in Colorado, and he ultimately just opted to go home, ended up spending 5 years as a basketball coach for Colorado College, but never coached football after that. And as a result, BYU's 1924 season was the end of an era, the first era, I guess, of BYU's first ever football coach. So let's talk a little bit about how things went in 1924 for the Cougars. I'll take down this Knute Rockne overlay now, and I'll show you guys my pretty face once again. But in 1924, by far the most successful season of Alvin Twitchell's brief tenure as BYU head coach. 3 seasons overall for him, and BYU on the season ended up going 2-3-1 with a mark of 1-3-1 in Rocky Mountain Conference play. They finished 9th in the league and were outscored a total of 61-44. Now, it's never good to be outscored by your opponents because that means you're probably going to have a losing record. But this is, remember, 1922. We talked about the fact that BYU in the entirety of their debut season had 10 points scored against 184 points scored on them. Brutal numbers. It improved a little bit in 1923. And in 1924, once again, it was the best mark of Alvin Twitchell's tenure at BYU. So the thing about this is it's going to be something that would be BYU's MO early on in their football history, was the fact that they had paltry offensive outputs. Now, this season in 1924, they started it where they left off in 1923. If you recall from yesterday's episode, BYU finished up their season losing to Colorado College, funny enough, who Alvin Twitchell would end up coaching the very next year, just albeit in basketball. Well, they opened the 1924 season October 3rd at Colorado College and did just enough to squeak out a 3-0 victory. So BYU off to the season start with a 1-0 record. Then came a return trip to Montana State to face off against future BYU coach G. Ott Romney. And G. Ott Romney, after losing to BYU in 1923, got revenge with a 13-0 shutout of the Cougars in Bozeman. The following week, BYU had their annual rivalry game against the University of Utah. And unlike yesterday's show, when we talked about a Utah player biting a BYU player, nothing came of that. BYU did travel to Salt Lake and was summarily dismissed with a 35-6 beatdown at Utah. So if you're keeping track of the rivalry series so far, BYU 0 wins, Utah 3 wins, and it was going to get a whole lot worse before it got better for BYU football. And we'll discuss that in coming days and weeks. But then they finished up a 3-game set on November 7th in Provo against Utah Agricultural University, aka Utah State. Well, Utah State had been a routine opponent for BYU as members of this conference, and they ground out another 14-0 shutout of BYU. So after a season opening win, BYU suddenly sat at 1-4 on the season, 3 straight losses. Then they made the trip to Western State, Colorado for their lone non-conference matchup in Gunnison, Colorado, and came out with a 26-13 victory, giving BYU a little bit of more momentum going into their season finale. November 15th, just 4 days after facing off against Western State, they took on Colorado School of Mines in Golden, Colorado, and ended the season with their first ever tie. You heard that right. Ties are a thing in this era of college football. They'd actually be a thing up until the 1990s, early 1990s. And in this game, neither team could really do much in Golden. Ended up with a 0-0 tie. That's thrilling stuff right there. I can tell you that much. That's how BYU ends up with an overall record of 2-3-1 on the season. Once again, finishing in 9th place in the Rocky Mountain Conference, just behind Colorado Mines. Wyoming, once again, was the bottom dweller. Colorado would go on to win the conference title. Utah State would finish in 2nd, and Utah just a couple of spots ahead of BYU in 7th place in the conference. So overall, an improvement for BYU, but once again, the end of an era. The first ever coaching run for Alvin Twitchell at BYU ended with him having his best season to date, but still BYU not quite to the 500 mark in terms of their overall season. So tomorrow on the show, we'll discuss who took over for Alvin Twitchell. It should be a fun thing to do. But if you're keeping track at home in terms of the overall record for Alvin Twitchell, he ended up having a grand total of 5 wins, 13 losses and 1 tie in his career at BYU, and obviously went on to have a pretty good run as a basketball coach. Ended up a career record, I believe, of his head coaching tenure, if this is to be believed, that I'm looking at right now, 151 crossing both his time at BYU over 5 seasons, as well as 5+ seasons in Colorado. So that's the end of the Alvin Twitchell era. But the one other thing I should point out on today's show, I'm going to throw up a graphic here, was the BYU was playing at a place called the Fifth West Field for the first few years of their football tenure. I guess not the football tenure, for football history. But the thing is, this graphic I just threw up comes from the 1924 Banyan for BYU, and that was the first renderings of what would become the first on-campus stadium for BYU football, to my knowledge. Now, if you're looking at this, you're probably wondering, okay, where were they planning to put this, Jake, and where would they ultimately put it? Well, where the current Richards Building pool is, BYU built their first ever on-campus football stadium. Now, this rendering was the chatter was starting to really kind of mount for BYU to get in and build an on-campus stadium, and that's where it would ultimately be built. But the first renderings here were just that. They were just renderings. It would take some time for BYU to get their ducks in a row and obviously build that stadium. But once they had it, obviously it would be something they would be very, very proud of, and we'll talk about that in a future edition of the podcast. But really, the 1924 season is where chatter and the like reading up on this is where things really started getting serious about BYU wanting to invest in their football program. So that's what I've got for you guys in 1924, the first ever tie for BYU, the first kind of moves towards an on-campus stadium. And yeah, crazily enough, the end of the first run of a head coach in BYU football history. solid, albeit unspectacular debut for the BYU football program across their first 3 seasons. We'll talk about 1925 tomorrow for BYU, and I'll just tease ahead to this. The team captain of the 1925 squad would end up becoming a future head coach at BYU, the first ever homegrown talent, as it were, for the BYU football program. And we'll dig into that on tomorrow's edition of Locked On Cougars.